Welcome back to Football Talk with Xavier. My name's Xavier, and today we're going to be going over my NFL mock draft. After the first 2 weeks of NFL free agency, we've had major signings like Russell Wilson signing with the Giants. It looks like Aaron Rodgers is going to sign with the Steelers. Stephon Diggs is signed with the Patriots, and it just looks like the NFL is going to be very, very different next year. So let's take a look at what the NFL draft may look like after all these big moves. With the number one pick in the draft, we have the Tennessee Titans. The Tennessee Titans are going to end up drafting Cam Ward out of Miami to be their quarterback of the future. I personally don't like the pick, but I think it's what's going to happen. Next up, we've got the Cleveland Browns, and I think it's pretty obvious you want to make the strength of your football team the best thing in the entire NFL. And what I mean by that is you just sign Myles Garrett, now get Abdul Carter, and make the best pass rush in the entire NFL. It will help you win those low-score games that you're going to have to win because you don't have a quarterback. With the third overall pick, you have the New York Giants. As I mentioned, they just signed Russell Wilson. So what that means is you're probably either going to look to get him a weapon or you're going to look to get him some help on the defensive side of the ball. I personally think you can do both with Travis Hunter, so I think they go with Travis Hunter with the number 3 pick in the draft. Next up, you got the New England Patriots. And at first I had them going Ted McMillan, but the more I watched his run blocking, what he ran in the 40, which was a 4.55, I just don't really think he's worth the 4th overall pick. So I think you either go offensive line or you go Ashton Jeanty here. And I think what you're going to do is take Will Campbell, the best offensive lineman in this draft. He can play tackle or guard for you. Just a really great player who you know is going to be successful in the NFL. With the number 5 overall pick, you've got the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I love Mason Graham going here. I think he's one of the few elite players in this draft, so to get him at number 5 is a solid pick. Next up, you got the Las Vegas Raiders, and I think there's really only 2 options here, maybe 3. Ted McMillan's my 3rd one. Number 2 is Shedeur Sanders, and number 1 is Ashton Jeanty. I think Ashton Jeanty is going to be a Hall of Fame running back if he can stay healthy. And with Pete Carroll coming in and being your head coach, we know he loves the running game, so I personally like them to go Ashton Jeanty out of Boise State here. Number 7, we've got the New York Jets. You just went out and got Justin Fields, so you're probably not going to draft a quarterback because you just went with the young quarterback. So what I like you to do here is to help him out. Devontae Adams just left, so what if you get Teteroa McMillan to pair up with Garrett Wilson? That'd be a pretty good combo. But a lot of GMs, from what I'm learning, don't love Ted McMillan as a prospect. I personally don't know why. I think he's going to be solid in the NFL. I don't think he's going to be an all-pro, but I think he's going to be a very, very good receiver in the NFL. So they're probably going to look to get some help on the defensive side of the ball. And I personally believe that the best defensive players in this class are Jahdae Barron, Malachi Stark, and Abdul Carter, who's already gone. And since Abdul Carter's already gone, you're looking here to maybe get some offensive line help because you don't think the other 2 are positions of need. Therefore, what I'm going to ultimately have you doing is going Armand Membu out of Missouri, a guy who tested really, really good at the combine and is going to come in and be an excellent tackle in the NFL. Next up, you got the Carolina Panthers, and this is where I have Ted McMillan going. I might disagree with some people, but I think you have to get Bryce Young some help. I know the defense was terrible, but what will ultimately help Bryce in his development is getting a guy like Tet, who's a big body receiver who can catch anything that you throw in his area. So I love that pick there for them. At number 9, some people don't really love this pick. I personally don't think he's a top 10 pick in the draft, but I think you don't love Derek Carr that much if you're the Saints right now. So you want his backup plan in Shedeur Sanders, can come in and learn from Derek and ultimately grow into being a really good quarterback in the NFL with enough time. Next up, you got the Chicago Bears. And for me personally, I think the best pick the Bears could make is Ashton Jeanty. But he's not on the board in this mock draft. So what I think they're ultimately going to do is go with the position of need. You could use a pass rusher and you could use a safety. I personally think Malachi Starks is the best player still on the board, but a lot of teams don't value safeties in the top 10 picks of the draft, so you're probably going to see an edge rusher. I personally like Mike Green out of Marshall to go here. Really, really great player. Put up a ton of sacks, ton of production at Marshall, which is a smaller school, but he showed out at the Senior Bowl to show that he is a legit talent in the NFL. Next up at number 11, what we're really looking here with the 49ers is probably a Trent Williams replacement. Trent Williams is probably not going to play another year or 2 in the NFL, so Do you like Kelvin Banks Jr. or Josh Simmons? I personally think Kelvin Banks Jr. is a really solid player there at number 11. If they don't go with that, I really like them going Walter Nolan out of Ole Miss, and that's personally who the Cowboys might go with too, because we see with the Cowboys here that their positions of need are running back. Ashton Genty's already gone, so you can't take him. Wide receiver, I love the idea of Matthew Golden going here, but I don't know if it's worth it with how your roster's built. I personally would do that if I were them, but I could also understand if they wanted to get someone on the other side of Micah Parsons to pair up with him in James Pierce Jr., and that's ultimately what I'm going to have them doing here. Next up at pick number 13, we've got the Dolphins. They need interior D-line help. They need offensive line help. And I think which one matters the most to them, I'd say offensive line help, because the system that you run is very dependent on Tua having time in the pocket. So I like Josh Simmons out of Ohio State here, guy who put up solid production in college, but was injured to end his senior season there. So declared for the draft, and who knows what he's really going to look like after injury. If he didn't get hurt, he'd probably get drafted way earlier. Next up at pick 14, Tyler Warren. Easy, one of the best players in this draft, but he's a tight end, so I think he falls down here to the Colts. Pick 15, we've got the Falcons, and while I think they would love to go corner here, or maybe even linebacker, I think what they need the most is pass rushing help. So do you get a hybrid guy who can pass rush and play linebacker? I personally love them doing that, and there's actually a guy in this draft who can do it, and that's Jalen Walker. A lot of scouts say he looks a lot like Micah Parsons. Abdul Carter also looks a lot like Micah Parsons, so it's interesting to see which one of them is going to be closer to him in the NFL, and if either of them can, that's a great pick. Next up at pick 16, this is where I'm going to have Walter Nolan out of Ole Miss go. The Arizona Cardinals need some interior O-line help or some interior D-line help, and I personally think Walter Nolan is the best player on the board at one of those two positions. But don't be surprised if Jahdae Barron is still here if they go with him. I'm telling you, Jahdae Barron is one of the best players in this draft class. Next up at 17, you've got the Cincinnati Bengals, and they could use anything on the defense or anything on the O-line. So, like I said, best player in this class right now, I think is Jahdae Barron. I think you go Jahdae Barron right there. Next up at pick 18, you got the Seattle Seahawks. You need interior O-line help. That's really what you need, because you saw Sam Darnold in the playoffs collapse when the O-line collapsed with them. So what I personally like you doing here is going with Tyler Booker out of Alabama, a guy who's going to come in the NFL and be very solid from day one. I don't think he's going to ever be an All-Pro, but he's a really solid guard. Next up, we got the Buccaneers, and this is another one of my favorite picks in the draft, Jihad Campbell out of Alabama. You lost your linebackers. You're taking Jihad to replace him, and Jihad is a stud of a player. Next up, you got the Denver Broncos. You need receiver help. And having Luther Burden fall here, and Matthew Golden fall here, and Emeka Egbuka here, you really get to choose which one you like the most. I personally like Luther Burden III the most, but there was a decline in his senior season, so I would fully understand if Matthew Golden was taken just because of that 40 time. You could do so much with him, but if you really think about it, the Broncos already have Marvin Mims, who's their gadget guy who can run really fast, so Luther Burden actually makes more sense with the pick here. Don't be surprised if they maybe go Colston Loveland too. There's a lot of different options they could go with there. Despite them signing Evan Ingram in free agency, 2 tight ends always works in the Sean Payton system. Next up, you got the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I really hate this pick because I don't think he should be a first-round pick. I think he should be a second-round pick and get a year to develop. But since the Pittsburgh Steelers didn't bring back Russell Wilson, I think they go Jackson Dart out of Ole Miss. Next up, you got the Chargers, and I think the Chargers personally here are either going to go Kenneth Grant or Colston Loveland, whichever one Jim Harbaugh would rather reunite with the most. I personally think it's Colston Loveland because that offense fell apart in the playoffs because of the lack of talent. Next up, you've got the Packers. Here, you're taking your stud receiver that you need in Matthew Golden. Easy pick, him or Emeka Egbuka, take a receiver right there for the Packers, even though you don't normally do it. Next up, you got the Vikings, and I personally like Will Johnson here or Malachi Starks. Whichever one Brian Flores wants the most to fit in his defense. But those aren't the only 2 players I could see them taking. If they value running back enough, Amari Hampton is a great pick here. If they want interior D-line help, Kenneth Grant is a great pick here. they could really do no wrong going with 4 or 5 different guys. But in this mock draft, I'm going to personally have them go with Will Johnson because I think it's the biggest position of need because you re-signed Aaron Jones to play running back for you. Next up, we have the Houston Texans, and I think the Houston Texans ultimately need O-line help more than anything else, but they could also use a receiver. And when you really look at the board here, I think the best player available at those positions is Emeka Egbuka, so go out and get some help for Nico Collins. They both do 2 completely different things, which will help CJ Stroud out a lot, and it's an Ohio State guy. He would personally love that. Next up, you got the Rams, and this is where I see Colston Loveland going if he hasn't already been picked. But because he's been picked, the Rams are in a position where they just need to get help either on the O-line or on that defensive side of the ball. They had 2 great picks on defense last year, so what I like them to do here is look to go with the linebacker. Or if they really just want to go best player available, I love them to go Malachi Starks. I just don't think they need a safety that bad. But I think when you're really looking at the board, it's not even close on who's the best player left. So I personally like them going Malachi Starks here. It's not a position of need, but best player available is ultimately what's going to win you championships in the NFL, and I think that's what they're trying to do, going for it all once again with Matthew Stafford. Next up, you got the Baltimore Ravens. You need interior O-line help. I like Gray Zabel out of North Dakota State here. You could also use an edge like Mykel Williams, like Shamar Stewart, or even Donovan out of Boston College. But what I personally love you doing is going Mykel Williams out of Georgia. I think there's a lot of untapped potential there that they could get from him. May not be as good of a scheme fit as Shamar Stewart for them, but I just love Mykel Williams as a player. Next up, you've got the Detroit Lions, and the Detroit Lions could use some help at a variety of different positions, but what they need to do is ultimately take who they think is going to be the most beneficial for them. They have a power running game, so Gray Zabel might be the option for that. But your defense got so banged up last season that you couldn't do anything. So are you extra cautious and keep on just taking defenders? Probably. I like Donovan out of Boston College here. Player who's going to fall in this draft class, but is a really, really good player overall. Next up, you got the Washington Commanders, and I just love it for them if Amari Hampton is still here. Him or Gray Zabel. I'm going to keep saying those 2 names because they're great players who should get picked in this range. So it comes down to, do you think Amari Hampton is a better overall player than Gray Zabel? I say yes. But do you value a running back in the first round when there's so many in this draft? I say no. And I think you go Gray Zabel, move him into guard. He showed at the Senior Bowl that he can play every position on the field. Next up, you got the Buffalo Bills. You need help on the defensive side of the ball. I love you to go get Kenneth Grant. I honestly do. I think he is your best option here. So that's what I have them doing here. Is going Kenneth Grant out of Michigan. Next up, you got the Chiefs. And it just makes all the sense in the world for the Chiefs to draft a tackle, Josh Connolly Jr., move him over to left tackle, and hope that he fixes your O-line problems. If you're going to continue to remain competitive, you've got to get that O-line fixed. Next up, you got the Eagles. And I continually have them taking Trey Amos here because I think they need a cornerback more than anything else after they let Darius Slay walk, but they've also let a lot of edge guys go. So even though this is uncharacteristic of them of taking a potential pick, they usually just take players that can flat out play. I like them to go Shamar Stewart because I believe he's the best edge still on the board. And that concludes my 2025 NFL mock draft post NFL free agency, after a lot of the signings have went down and we're only awaiting a few more to happen.